A complex with an explosive past, now lying forgotten in the woods.
The most fascinating structures are these round cylinders with reinforced ribs on the outside. This was highly specialized.
Grand coastal defenses in Ghana that are stark reminders of the brutal trade in slaves.
When you see the extent of these fortifications, how many there are, and how solidly they were constructed, the first question that comes to your mind is, why here? What was so valuable?
A huge hidden nuclear bunker in Florida, USA.
Just this vast, cavernous chamber that echoes with every footfall and clearly meant to house something really important.
And a decaying giant that was once at the heart of Serbia's industrial revolution.
It was supposed to symbolize a new future for the country, a new hope for the people. But this specific site would play a part in the country's history that no one could have foreseen.
Crumbling remains and ruins of lost worlds. They were shaped by extraordinary events and are now haunted by the past. Their secrets are waiting to be revealed. Hidden from view, deep in the forests of western Poland, a peculiar group of buildings stretch out over a colossal site.
To start off, you're just in the forest, but you begin to realize that man has been here and left quite a mark. It begins with little things, railway tracks, odd bits and pieces, but then gradually it begins to reveal more and more buildings. They're everywhere.
So the buildings you first come to just look like something out of a sci-fi movie. They're these giant concrete structures that seem to be on these legs that could come alive at any time.
Very, very well constructed, but when you look down from above, they're absolutely open to the elements. There's no roof. It's clearly a very unique structure.
And then you turn a corner and there's a different building, more rectangular structure.
This is so abandoned. There's very little that can tell you what the purpose of this was, except that some kind of industrial enterprise was here, but you can't tell what it was.
But what can be discovered by traveling a little deeper into the forest?
There are these big open basins, and they look corroded in some kind of way, and there's channels leading from them. So there was action not just above ground, but also below.
While its original purpose may be unclear, one thing is certain.
This is a complex of buildings that shouldn't be in a forest. This is an urban kind of complex. There's something secretive and special that's going on here, and some people have put a lot of effort to hide this very substantial complex away.
With railway tracks stretching through the forest, this site was clearly of major importance.
We have this large complex spread over a large landscape of buildings with old rail lines, trees intergrown everywhere. You're only seeing a fraction at the first glance. This is a really, really big operation.
There's a railway that terminates there, so there was obviously a lot of goods either coming in or going out of this place, but what were they?
Radoslav Domka is a historian from the nearby University of Zielona Góra. For many years, he has been researching the buildings here to try and uncover the mysteries that surround them.
So this ramp were for transporting coal to power plant. Coal gives energy for this whole object.
When you look at the power plant and you think about the amount of coal, the amount of fuel that's coming into this place, there's clearly a need to make a lot of electricity. This is a very power-hungry manufacturing process, whatever's going on here.
The railway didn't only serve the power plant. At the other end of the site, there are structures that are central to understanding this place's true purpose.
When we are looking on this object, it's hard to know function about this building. You have to have very specific knowledge about engineering. For many Poles, even from the west side of Poland, this place is a huge secret. The people don't realize that it was so important, that it was so dangerous.
The unusual design served a very important function.
What we are seeing here is silos. It was very dangerous material here inside the silo, and that's why this construction is so hard and monumental. If you look around, you can see that in the case of explosion, the blast will go up. It minimalizes victims around the area.
This was a vast explosives manufacturing plant, with this distinctive feature at its very heart.
These are not small silos. The space is utterly vast, which is mind-boggling at the moment, but it's even more mind-boggling to think that this vast space was full of explosives.
There was, of course, the ever-present risk of a terrible accident. So the layout of the whole place was designed with safety in mind.
Obviously, making explosives is not without its dangers, so it makes perfect sense that you're going to locate a munitions factory far away from towns and villages, but not only that, you're going to put the separate elements of the factory far apart.
The chemicals needed to make munitions are highly reactive. They're designed to explode, but of course in their raw state, in their early state, they're really hard to control. Moving this highly unstable material from place to place, you want it to be as smooth as possible, and the railway lines are the best way to do that.
But a few important questions remain. Who was manufacturing explosives on such a vast scale? And why do they want to keep it a secret? The history here is rooted in the continent's darkest days during the Second World War.
Hitler had these very ambitious plans to have this huge production of explosives and huge production of munitions for the German Reich. Once the war begins and the Germans had seized Poland, now they can actually create this new system of industrial enterprises.
This was one of its centerpieces, the Christianstadt Dynamite Factory. It was originally owned by DAG, a company that was founded by the inventor of dynamite himself, Alfred Nobel. At its peak, it was producing more than 6,500 tons of explosives every month.
The things that they were making at this factory are mind-boggling. There's evidence that they were making RDX, which is more explosive than TNT. This baby goes boom. And you have got so much of it being stored. And also, there's suspicion that they made nitroglycerin. Now, nitroglycerin is one of the most explosive chemicals there is. I've only ever seen it in tiny vials, let alone giant vats.
While the scale of the complex is staggering, there was an even darker side to the whole operation.
Making ammunitions is dangerous work. So you would think the people making it would be highly trained professionals with years of experience, right? No. Here, you've got forced labor. So these are ordinary people, prisoners of war. They were made to make these ammunitions that were then potentially going to be used on their own people.
For those forced to work here, life was almost unbearable.
The conditions were terrible. It was very unhealthy to work here, to work in that kind of industry, and also a treatment of guards, because if they want to be aggressive against the prisoner or worker, they did. Not only disease, not only conditions, but the treatment of a crew was very dangerous for life.
If somebody tried to escape, if somebody tried any defiance, they could be executed on the spot without any difficulty, and you just simply get another slave laborer.
Hitler's Nazis seem to have designed the complex perfectly for maximum efficiency. That changed one early morning in 1944.
Very little documentation about this site survives, but one fact we do know was there was a massive explosion, which, given the war, makes you think about sabotage.
If it was sabotage, then who was responsible?
It was before the workers started, and it only hit some of the key buildings. We may never know what actually happened here, but with a forced workforce and active Polish resistance in the area, if you put 2 and 2 together from that, you get an inside job. And that's what led to this active sabotage, these explosions, and bringing about a stop to the manufacture of weapons here.
Contemporary reports suggest that during 1944 and 1945, no fewer than 3 separate unexplained explosions caused major damage at Christianstadt. But when the war ended, the Nazis destroyed most of the documentation detailing what went on here. All items of value were looted by the invading Russians, and eventually the buildings were abandoned to the forest. Today, it's all parkland, open to the public, and very few visitors here know the secrets that surround it.
I have 2 feelings. One feeling is admiring of this, the genial engineering thought, the huge monumental buildings. But on the other hand, my grandfather was a prisoner, and I know the condition of living in a camp during the Second World War, so the second feeling is sadness. People worked in very bad condition here, and it was very ungood for them health, for their lives, for their families.
Beneath an innocuous-looking mound of earth near the east coast of Florida in the USA is a long-forgotten relic.
Just off a freeway and hidden amongst the trees, you've got this sort of stepped white wall leading to just quite a plain white door. You realize maybe that door is hiding something quite intriguing.
So you've got this thick concrete wall. Then on top of this low little hill, you have these various ventilation shafts. There's something under here, something that was important at one time, but today there's no sign of what that was.
As you go through the big steel doors, you're met with a second security zone, like a decontamination chamber. Whatever was in here, it certainly meant business.
But what was the purpose of this bizarre structure? And what threats would it face?
One thing that's really striking here is the whole thing is built with these large steel beams. They look strong enough to support a skyscraper or a stadium, and yet all that's above this is just a grassy mound.
So, there's an impressive array of structural protection on display here, obviously all designed to shelter what was inside.
Just this vast, cavernous chamber that echoes with every footfall and clearly meant to house something really important.
What was all this built to conceal? And from whom? This site, which was located near to the Kennedy Space Center, dates back to the time of the space race and an era of worrying uncertainty for the entire world.
This bunker was built in 1967, the height of the Cold War. Florida might not seem like a military center, but it was close to Cuba, which is an area that we always worried might have nuclear weapons. And of course, in the Cuban Missile Crisis, that was all about trying to get Russia to remove nuclear weapons from Cuba.
What's interesting about this bunker is its orientation, because if you expand to look at the larger area, you'll notice that the main entrance and the exposed part of the bunker is facing away from the Kennedy Center. Now, the reason for this is if there was any attack, The Kennedy Center is the most likely location. So if you face away from it, you're going to be better protected.
That wasn't the only remarkable thing here. The level of all-round protection was unprecedented. Mark Oxley is an expert on the history of the site.
So this isn't your normal nuclear fallout bunker. This is actually something a little bit different. It was hardened to such a degree that the outside walls are 18 inches thick, but some of the interior walls go as thick as 48 inches. The foundation was also 9 feet thick.
The heavy use of metal in the structure tells us that it was designed for something else.
But what you'll notice is right up here. This was actually one of AT&T's and the Department of Defense's communications bunkers. The goal of this bunker was to keep the hardened communications of both the AT&T long-distance long lines as well as the military's Autovon network secure in case of nuclear war.
In the aftermath of a nuclear attack, it was feared that people would swamp the telephone exchange as they tried to reach loved ones. But the military would need guaranteed open telephone lines to coordinate its response. Enter the Autovon network and its priority status.
The Autovon network ran parallel to the normal communications network. This was a way for the Defense Department and the executive branch to maintain communication between key defense agencies and key military assets during a crisis.
The bunker was just one small part of a much larger project.
So there are these bunkers scattered around the United States from coast to coast, and they're all like 75, 100 miles apart in this intricate web around the country.
AT&T actually built 3 different kinds of bunkers. One type was full of communications equipment. Another type had power generating equipment. And the third type had microwave equipment. A microwave link can send telephone data across the open air without having to be connected by wires. So you can imagine how that could be very valuable in the aftermath of a war.
While it would have seen unimaginable destruction across the land, a nuclear blast wasn't the real danger for a place like this. That was the resulting electromagnetic pulse, which would have wiped out electrical equipment for miles around. So, how would the site and its operators have survived down here in the aftermath of nuclear Armageddon?
Being inside the structure is kind of like being inside of a steel cage. And that's important because one of the risks of a nuclear war is that when a nuclear weapon goes off in the atmosphere, it sends out this bolt of electricity that could destroy electronics for hundreds of miles away. So if you want to protect your sensitive electrical equipment, you want to put it inside a cage of metal, a Faraday cage. And that's exactly what they did here.
A Faraday cage, it can be something as simple as chicken wire. It's just a metal mesh. And what it does is it basically neutralizes electrical charges. So inside of the bunker, you'll have your people or any equipment, and all of that is protected from anything else that would be going on outside.
While protecting the equipment was the purpose of the bunker, it would have all been for nothing if there was no one left alive to operate it. It had to be habitable, even in the event of a nuclear attack.
There were large cans of powdered butter, powdered eggs, spaghetti, meat sauce, I mean, all kinds of things. And those were meant to sustain 5 people, 5 workers within this facility for 30 days, 24/7.
The men here would never have left the bunker. It would have gone into lockdown until those inside were notified that it was safe to go outside.
So this is one of the radiation detectors. Basically, these are planted all around the facility, both on top of the facility and below the facility. They were meant to detect gamma radiation. So in case of a nuclear strike or nuclear event in the area, this would basically send a signal to the remote monitoring station and automatically close all the blast doors in the facility and turn the carbon air filtration systems on to ensure that the air quality was preserved inside the facility.
Once the blast doors were shut, access to and from the bunker would have been strictly controlled.
So if you had entered after a radioactive event, there would be these massive lead-lined doors blocking your entrance into the facility. So what you'd have to do is you would be in your decontamination suit, and you'd be entering what is known as the decontamination shower. This is where you would rinse off all of the radioactive particles that were on you so that you wouldn't be traipsing them into the main clean environment. That was critical to ensure that everybody who was inside stayed alive.
But would the people garrisoned here ever be called into action? And how would the site find a new strategic importance in the future?
Imagine the job that these people were asked to do. You go and you live in this bunker. You're waiting for a nuclear war you desperately hope would never happen. If it did happen, you'd have to wonder, was your family and everyone you know wiped out? Meanwhile, you've got this difficult task to perform, and they were expected to stay on that station and run these communications for up to a month after any potential conflict.
Fortunately, the men inside never faced such a desperate situation. And in 1979, as a new and improved system was being rolled out across the country, the military abandoned the bunkers for good. Today, a new use has been found for this extraordinary place, as Mark explains.
Well, everything today is internet-based. The Internet of Things is everywhere. Everybody relies on their cell phones heavily, GPS navigation. It has to be processed where there's a lot of power and a lot of processors, and that would happen in a data center like this one.
The bunker is being prepped for that next stage of its life, as a place to securely store row upon row of servers. And with hacking and climate change both potential challenges in the future, it is not the only one of its kind being repurposed.
This Cold War relic is now being imitated all around the world among America's peer adversaries in order to secure their data from anything that might bring down a vitally important network and compromise the security of the state.
Along the stunning coastline of Ghana are striking buildings that dominate the surroundings.
There are these enormous white buildings sat high above the coastline. They're almost like palaces, with elaborate staircases, plazas, and archways. They're hugely impressive.
As you go up the coast, you see there's more than one of these rising from the cliff faces. Some of them are just rubble now, but others are in pretty good shape. They were built to last.
When you get closer to the buildings, it's clear that these buildings were built for defensive purposes. But it's not only how they're positioned, it's the cannons, it's the firepower.
But behind the imposing walls are scenes that paint a confusing picture.
The deeper one goes into the building, the more one finds. There's a whole hidden world right under the surface.
The darkness is all-consuming. The air is thick and heavy. Damp and decay is all around. Shackles rattle on the walls, and thick steel doors cover tiny enclaves.
It's such an odd place. The contrast is so enormous between the floors above ground, the opulence of them, the sense of space and light, the beautiful views of the shore and the ocean, and then underground, it's a veritable dungeon.
So, what were these places designed for? The answer lies in a period of great European expansion. During the 15th century, seafaring traders began to arrive on the shores of Ghana. They would alter forever the course of history in Western Africa. These white forts are legacies of those first landings long ago.
The first colonizers were the Portuguese. Southwestern Europeans with the knowledge, the experience, and the national purpose to embark on the enterprise of developing oceanic trade routes with Africa and Asia. They'd come to find raw materials, but what they stumbled upon was beyond their wildest dreams.
The Akan peoples of the coast had access to considerable supplies of gold, and they were willing to trade it to Europeans for base metals, textiles, and other manufactured goods.
The coast became so valuable that the Portuguese referred to it simply as mina, the mine. More poetically, the English later named it the Gold Coast.
The Portuguese were willing to do whatever they could to defend the gold, so they did whatever it took, including building these fortifications.
These are Ghana's coastal forts, a string of imposing defenses built by powerful European empires. Alex Kingsley-Okpei is a local historian here.
We are here in one of the oldest European structures along the West African coast called the Elmina Castle, constructed by the Portuguese in 1482. This castle was built with materials from Portugal and then Holland. See how thick the walls are, formidable, impregnable, made to withstand attacks.
These forts were built to be intimidating. 4 outer towers formed the batteries, cannons stretched all along the front, and huge towering walls rose up from the rocks below. It would have been a huge undertaking, but it was essential to keep other European powers away and ensure that the local people only sold their gold to agents of the Portuguese crown.
These forts accomplished exactly what they were designed to. We know from records that up to 1550, the Portuguese were getting up to 12,400 ounces of gold annually, which was a sizable proportion of gold coming into Europe at the time.
But soon, other European powers would try to muscle in on the scene. The Portuguese had something that many other countries wanted for themselves.
The Netherlands, Spain, England, France, they all coveted the wealth that was pouring out of the Gold Coast, and they were willing to fight tooth and nail to get their hands on their share of it.
By the 17th century, the Portuguese couldn't fight them off anymore, and their domination came to an end. With the market now open to all, different nations built their own forts and battled to protect trade in their area. In total, there were around 40 forts along this coastline, owned by different nations. They stretched for more than 300 miles.
The trade these forts were protecting was also changing. As across the world, the market for a new commodity was beginning to flourish. It came from the lush tropical islands of the Caribbean.
Sugar was hugely desirable and fetched a very high price. Europeans couldn't get enough of it. The problem was that it was very difficult to produce. You needed a very large, very dependable labor force. And the Caribbean and the Americas just didn't have that anymore. You had an indigenous population that had been decimated by disease, so they weren't available for this type of labor. And even the poorest Europeans were unwilling to brave the expensive passage and the terrible living and working conditions for the meager salary that working on a sugar plantation would fetch.
However, in the eyes of the European powers, that labor force could be found in Ghana and the countries beside it. The trade in gold was now making way for the trade in people.
The wealth that would be opened up by the slave trade in terms of labor to produce raw commodities really created tremendous wealth in terms of trading people, laborers.
But back across the Atlantic, on the western coast of Africa, there was a steady supply of labor that the Europeans were willing to do anything to obtain, provided there was a profit in it, and the profits would be immense.
The Europeans are able to come in and exploit instability in Africa and get enslaved labor that would be sent to the Americas.
At the heart of this new trade were the forts.
We are standing within the infamous Cape Coast Castle, built by the British around 1664. It was built during the slave trade, the infamous slave trade. And within these, we have deep dungeons where the males were kept. I know about 1,000 were kept at a time. And they live in very horrible conditions, tight, packed together like sardines. Little air for them to breathe, little water for them to drink, no good for them, no medical attention. They slept on the floor. Where they slept, that's where they ate, that's where they defecated, that's where they urinated.
The conditions were horrific, and a large percentage of the slaves died before they even got on the boats.
Men and women were kept separately, but the treatment of women was no better. In fact, for some, it was even worse.
Now we have then the female slave dungeons, and within this one, between 200 and 300 young ladies were kept here. On top, you could be taken out, sexually abused, and brought back. A greater number of the female slaves were used as sex slaves. So through these dungeons, women of substance, women of honor, women of value had to keep quiet and endure all the atrocities because they had no power of their own, they had no strength, they had no voice. Everything had been taken from them. Who are they going to call? They was going to respond to their call.
Like many of the other forts, Cape Coast Castle was a place of extreme contrasts.
A few yards, a few meters away from these cavernous dungeons are airy light rooms with parquet floors, elaborate furnishings, and scenic vistas that the people involved who would profit off of the slave trade where they lived.
It is horrendous to think that they just went about their normal day-to-day lives, completely detached from the unfathomable human suffering they were consciously inflicting just meters away.
What fate lay in store for those suffering the unspeakable conditions of these Ghanaian castles? Over some 300 years, an estimated 12.5 million Africans were shipped to the New World.
Right, so this was the final point of call of the captives. If you survive your stay here, eventually this is where you're going to go through, whether male or female. They call it door of no return. Out here, then into a boat, carried away, transferred into a ship, and then carried to the Americas and Caribbeans.
This was the scene of one of the worst institutions in human history, if not the absolute worst. The cruelty is almost unimaginable, and it continued all the way up until 1814, not that long ago, really.
The slave trade was ended during the 19th century, but it was only during the decline of the British Empire in the 20th century that these forts and the land they stood on were finally handed back to the local people. For years, the castle's involvement in slavery was a taboo subject in Ghana. But now, the people are showing more interest in their history. In fact, Ghanaians themselves account for 70% of tourist numbers at the forts.
It really is a heritage site of its own in terms of its meaning, its significance. These forts, they're so important because people need to know what happened, and they stand as stark reminders of how human beings can treat other human beings.
In Belgrade, the capital of Serbia, there is a damaged structure that was once at the birth of a new age in the country's history.
This place looks like it's been to hell and back, like it's been torn up from the inside out. The stairs look like they're ready to snap under the weight of the first visitor, and the whole place looks as though it's ready to collapse.
Nature is gradually consuming this place. Birds are nesting in it, trees are growing out of the walls, and the earth is swallowing the place up.
This place looks like if it's hit by a powerful storm, then a whole chain reaction of destructive events will be set off in here. It's a miracle, really, that it's still standing.
It's clearly got a story to tell, but that story has become buried under years of waste. There's even a boat lost under a sea of trash.
There are other buildings around here, too. The place clearly isn't alone, and there's tracks linking it to these other structures. So we're looking at just one small part of a very vast industrial edifice.
This place was once a monument to a bright future, but the level of destruction here tells a different story.
And the place has clearly been through the wars. You can tell that immense change took place here.
The thing about this place is it was supposed to symbolize a new future for the country, a new hope for the people. But what unfolded here was in fact a disastrous setback and a devastating tragedy.
Buried amongst the rubble and waste are the origins of a groundbreaking moment in the modern history of Serbia.
Serbia had been under the rule of the Ottoman Empire since the 15th century, and in 1878, it finally got its independence.
They had effectively been a slave state under the Ottoman Empire, and now suddenly the shackles had been thrown off, and the country had the opportunity to make some progress.
Structures like this were the result, and a portent of what was to come.
At the time that Serbia gained its independence, everything was relatively small scale. This wasn't a heavily urbanized country. It wasn't in any way an industrialized country.
But under the rule of the new king of Serbia, investment from abroad was allowed. He had grand plans for the future of his country.
This building was going to be a central part of making that huge jump from an agricultural nation to an industrial nation.
This was the Belgrade sugar refinery.
There was sugar beet being produced, and they saw an opportunity. This could be exploited and used to fuel their industrial revolution.
As local expert Lugisha Ristic explains, this meant the beginning of a new Belgrade.
It was very important for the city, an entire complex with apartment buildings for the thousands of people who used to work here. It must be a very big change, and actually this industry produced a situation to start other industries.
You can just imagine what it was like back then. The din of the machines working, the employees hustling through, going about their business. For those involved, this must have felt really exciting.
The plan was to attract vast numbers of workers to kick-start growth in the city. But there were troubles from the very start.
In a few years, this company failed, and they actually asked for protection, bankruptcy, you know, and Serbian state took over, and from that on, it was actually owned by state.
Financial concerns weren't the only problems. A campaign for workers' rights would soon lead to a dramatic and bloody confrontation outside the gates.
The amount of change that industrialization caused was enormous, but it was also the speed of that change. One day, it wasn't here, and you've got a largely agricultural society and economy. And the next day, you've got full-scale industry.
You're now working according to the clock and according to the demands of whoever's running the factory. And not everyone is going to take to that very easily and with good reason. All across the Balkans, the changes that accompanied industrialization were accelerating the demand for workers' rights. Belgrade is going to see this earliest and heaviest because it's the first place in the country to witness heavy industrialization. And the struggle that's fought here is going to symbolize the struggle that will soon consume the whole country.
Wherever there are differences, wherever there are people making more than others, there will be tensions. And this was no exception.
By February 1907, the plight of the workers finally became desperate.
The records aren't exactly clear, but basically the German owners failed to comply or reneged on agreements relating to working conditions and rates of pay.
So a group of workers went to the factory management to issue them a warning. Honor your agreement or we'll strike.
Unfortunately, this push for rights or pay soon turned into a tragedy.
The battle lines were drawn, and the owners wouldn't back down. Nor would the 400 workers who opted to go on strike.
The workers occupied the factory, they stopped working, police came, they had the strike guards and everything. And after some days of these negotiations and everything, they crashed the strike with firearms.
On March the 14th, following 18 days of stalemate, the standoff came to an end and violence erupted.
Picketers were soon arming themselves with metal bars, iron spikes. Some even had knives or handguns.
We've all seen pictures, television, showing what happens in events like these. There are crowds on both sides, emotions are high, there's a lot of yelling, a lot of shouting. Violence is sometimes inevitable in these circumstances.
The shooting started. They were trying to arrest some leaders of the strike. It was very dramatic because it was a lot of workers, a lot of police, a lot of army, a lot of families, a lot of kids. And it was, at the end, a bloody end.
4 workers were killed in the violence. The factory owners were eventually forced to agree to improve conditions for workers, but it soon became apparent they had no intention of keeping their word.
The strike ended in defeat, but it set an important precedent. We can see it as the beginning of the true socialist movement in Serbia. And the battle fought there is going to be continued on for decades to come across the country.
The refinery survived the first encounter unscathed and was back in use straight away. But just down the line was World War I and World War II, then Soviet rule. This country was in for a tough time in the 20th century.
The sugar refinery was repaired, modified, and rebuilt over the years as a result of wars and foreign occupation. But it has somehow come to define the story of Serbia. It finally closed its doors in 1983. Against all the odds, the refinery has since had a colorful second life as an arts and theater venue. Lugisha has been heavily involved in shaping this positive new role for the building in Serbian life.
We found ourselves with a theater here, with no subsidies, with no way how to survive, and we started organizing rave parties, and this became very famous for the people like Goldie from London, like David Guetta, like Junior Jack, like Bob Sinclair. Everybody from the MTV scene, you know, came here. We had a lot of big parties for 3,000, 4,000, 5,000 people.
And so this building, which symbolizes a key moment in Serbia's social history, now has a new, bright future to look forward to.
Finally, city and the government came to us and said, now we will make a huge, biggest cultural center here. And that's what's going on at this very moment, and we are very happy about that.
Now they are abandoned, crumbling ruins. Many remind us of dark times, but some were once beacons of hope and progress, lasting testimonies to human imagination, enterprise, and spirit.